Thank you guys so much for being here with us today. It wasn't the easiest drive and parking, I imagine, but it's wonderful to be here with you. I'm Jessica Thebus.
And I'm Sarah Ruhl.
And we love being in conversation with each other. We've known each other for an awfully long time. We met, I believe, around the time when we were both in high school, kind of, at the Piven Theater Workshop in Evanston. And at that time, Sarah was a poet and I was sort of an actor. And since I became a director, and of course she became a playwright, as well as still being a poet and other things, and we've really enjoyed our artistic conversation over those many years. There's something so rewarding about being in an artistic conversation over a long period of time with people you really love and respect. And so it's a wonderful opportunity to be here and to have you guys as part of that conversation as well.
That was so beautifully said. And I think I'm going to read a little bit from this new book just to give you a sense of what it's about. It's called Smile, the Story of a Face, and then Jessica and I will talk.
Yep.
So yeah, thank you for coming and braving the Chicago Marathon madness.
While Sarah finds her first page, I'll just say also, we're all at this moment, right? This mid-pandemic, post-pandemic-ish moment where we're just beginning to gather again. I teach and am, did I go away? Okay. I teach and am gathering with students again, live in the room. And so it's just, I don't know, it feels so tender to be, everybody kind of brought their bodies into a room to be together. And it feels very germane too, because Sarah and I have been talking in reference to her wonderful new book about that it's very much about the body, about what happens when you can't ignore the body, and what all the things the body's connected to. And I feel like we've all been in that situation. You know, it's like, yeah, well, this thing happened and we can't really pretend that we don't have the body. And so it feels like such a great piece of work to be reading and thinking about at this particular moment. Thanks for bringing your bodies.
That's so beautifully said, and I think that if ever we wondered what the miracle of live theater was, it's been very clear this past year that part of the miracle is the fact that people leave their house at an appointed time, and they come and they turn their phones off and they bring their bodies in concert with other bodies. So it's been very hard to not have that. It did give me a chance to finish a book, so there was that.
Thank goodness for that.
Anyway, okay. Chapter 1, Twins. 10 years ago, my smile walked off my face and wandered out in the world. This is the story of my asking it to come back. This is a story of how I learned to make my way when my body stopped obeying my heart. But this story begins with hope, the very particular hope of a birth to come. I was lying down in a dressing gown, cold gel on my belly, waiting as the lab technician looked for a heartbeat. I already had a 3-year-old girl and was expecting my second child. I was also expecting to have a play I'd written to be performed on Broadway in 5 months, and was slightly nervous about the potential collision of two kinds of abundance. Suddenly, the lab technician pointed to the screen and said, "Do you know what that is?" "No," I said. I flashed on the ultrasound I'd had before miscarrying my second pregnancy, when the obstetrician had said the fetus looked not quite right and probably wouldn't last. "Don't go out and get drunk, though," she said, in a tone not quite teasing, "just in case it's viable." Not to worry," I'd said, wondering what gave her the impression that I would go out and get wasted that weekend. So this time, I feared the worst as I lay there, while the lab technician pointed at a screen I could not see. "Look," she said, pointing. There was movement, a heart beating, it seemed to me. A heartbeat, that's good, I thought. But what was wrong? Why was her brow furrowed? Was she alarmed? Or wait, was she pleased? "Did you use fertility treatment?" she asked. "No," I said. "Well," she said, "you have twins." "Oh," I said. "Do twins run in your family?" "No," I said, my mind racing to keep up with my body. "You can go to the waiting room," she said. I'll give you a list of new providers. We can no longer be your OBGYN because your pregnancy is now considered high risk. This was a great deal to absorb, that I had 2 babies inside me and was also now considered high risk, so much so that they wanted to get me out of their Soho office as soon as possible before I got preeclampsia and sued them. I got dressed. I happened to be alone for this appointment. I'd planned to meet my husband afterwards for lunch, where we would celebrate if there was a heartbeat or commiserate if there was not. Now I was sorry I'd come alone. I wanted to tell Tony the news immediately, but it also seemed strange to reveal such big tidings over the phone. So I texted him, "Meet me at Gramercy Tavern instead of at Rice." "Twins?" he texted back. Gramercy Tavern was closed for lunch. I guess I should point out it's a much nicer restaurant than Rice, if you don't live in New York. Tony and I went to Rice as planned. We were both in shock. Tony, on top of the shock, evinced buoyancy, elation. Being from a family of 3, he'd always wanted 3. Being from a family of 2, I'd settled on 2. I'd even at one point settled on 1, when I read in an Alice Walker essay that women writers should only have 1 child if they hope to remain writers. "With 1 child, you can move," wrote Walker. "With more than 1, you're a sitting duck." At lunch, Tony and I talked about how my miscarried child had wandered back, not to be excluded from this birth. We talked about how we'd manage with 3. I told Tony my fears, that my body could not contain this much abundance, and that I'd never write again. He said he had faith in my body and mind. At the end of the meal, I got a fortune cookie. I cracked it open. It read, "Deliver what is inside you, and it will save your life." What do you think? Should I keep reading, or should we talk a little, and then I can read some more?
We can talk a little, and then you can read some more.
Let's talk a little.
So you'll get the whole arc as we go. It's great to hear that, and one of the things that, well, because I'm so familiar with your work as a playwright, although of course, as I said, you're also a poet, you also write prose, but I've mostly worked with you in your work as a playwright, and I would extend this sort of thought about being embodied as like there's something very particular that a playwright does, which is not have their own body involved in the process, right? There are many of your plays that have autobiographical elements in them. Some might be more obvious to an audience, some might be very hidden from an audience, but you know, if you talk with you understand those autobiographical elements in the plays. But you know what you're doing, right, is you're like writing, creating a world, creating characters, creating a story that other people's bodies are going to make happen. And your own body is really private from that. There's a kind of real privacy that a writer has. And this was also true in your the wonderful book, The 100 Essays I Don't Have Time to Write. If you guys haven't read that one, that is terrific. It's about theater and also not about theater. And your body enters into that one too. And I've always been struck with how willing you are to have an intimate relationship with the reader, to really invite the reader close to your body and the processes and the imperfect processes of your body. And that kind of invites the reader to think about the imperfect processes of their body. Because I don't know, maybe we have some perfect bodies out there in the audience, but I don't know, probably fairly few. That everybody has these, complicated relationships to what their body is and looks like and does and is doing. And you bring us in when that's really different from what it is to write a play and invite other bodies in to participate in it.
It is different, and in some ways the role of the playwright suits me so well. I love being able to write language and have other people say it and move their bodies around instead of me. It's quite relaxing. You just sit in the back and someone else who's far better equipped does all those things, like playing some video game of the incarnation. It's kind of incredible. So writing memoir is different, and you're right, this one really says, I hit a wall in my life when I could not ignore my body. And I didn't actually think that was a worthy subject to write about.
Why not?
For many reasons. I suppose one, that it felt personal. For one other reason, that it felt not narrative. As you'll see later in the book, I get a condition called Bell's palsy, and most of the book is about that, but it's about other things too. And because for me, was a chronic condition without a kind of neat illness narrative where you have a hard thing happen to you and you endure it and you are cured, that's often the story of an illness narrative. Or there are tragic stories where there's an illness narrative and you lose a person. And this chronic story felt like it resisted a normal narrative progression. And the whole chronic condition irritated me and upset me, and so I didn't want to look at it. I just wanted to live my life and write my plays and be with my family and pretend it wasn't happening. And if I wrote about it, it was probably happening. I guess for a writer, that's when you know something is real.
Yeah, and do you want to say anything about what occurred that led you to open that door and actually write about it?
I mean, I think a number of things conspired, and I had written a shorter essay about it, and someone had been encouraging me to make it a full-length book, and I was very resistant. No, I'm not writing about that. And my husband, who's a psychiatrist, was like, well, why not? You know, you think about this a lot. It upsets you a lot. And often when you write a play, it's because you're thinking about something a lot or something's upsetting you. So why not try? And I thought, okay, I'll try. And very quickly, I wrote a book proposal that was, sort of pages poured out of me very rapidly. So it turned out I did have something to say. And my husband is he's good at persuading me of things, but he's often very insightful about what I'm actually thinking.
I wonder, too, do you think that gender plays a part in there? That what's going on with women's bodies shouldn't be spoken out loud? Or, I mean, I don't know, we haven't spoken about this, or shouldn't be talked about, or is some way boring, or is some way dirty, or I don't know. There's such a weird, I mean, I say this as a 55-year-old woman who is suddenly like, okay, wait a minute. Why haven't I heard anything about menopause that was useful in my whole life? So I just wonder about, our society is so like, yeah, you can do anything, you can say anything, it's all out there, we're so expressive, especially as Americans. But there also is like such a code of silence about female bodies.
There's more than a code of silence, there's active disgust. I think it makes people uncomfortable. I think as a writer, there's a fear that if you write about your body, it detracts from your mind, it makes you lesser than. Think about Donald Trump, or don't think about Donald Trump, but the moment where he said it was disgusting that Hillary Clinton went to the bathroom. How disgusting, he said. She went to the bathroom because people have to go to the bathroom so I think there's a cone of silence, there's a disgust or revulsion about women's embodiment. And I think for Bell's palsy, it's also a visible but invisible disease that's not talked about much. And I've been getting a lot of letters from people who've had it, who've been saying, thanks for finding language for it, because there was no language around it except for medical language.
Thank you for finding language for it. I'd like to just underline that, because, oh goodness, I don't know. Sometimes, I'm a director. As an artist, you're kind of like, is what I'm doing helpful? Is what I'm doing helpful at all to the world? And I love that. It's like putting language around it, finding the language for it, and offering that language to it. That's one of the things I do feel this book does that. And I feel the same way about the 100 essays. You say, you had a kind of like, I don't want to write about this, I don't want to talk about it, which makes sense. But actually, as a reader, I feel like both of these books, once you do it, there's a great bravery. I mean, bravery, it's not even the right word, ferocity about your willingness. You know, in the 100 essays, you take us into like lice. We're going to talk about lice. Miscarriage, we're going to talk about miscarriage in this book for sure. And even the piece you just read us is like the cold gel on the, you know, you could make a million choices as a writer of just like a couple sentences about how you found out. But instead you're like, come into my body, lying, a woman's body lying there with the ultrasound thing and the cold gel, which is very memorable if you've had an ultrasound. Like, if we're going to go there, you want us to really go there.
Well, and I think in terms of also these experiences we sometimes don't look at with detail, when you're having an ultrasound, someone's looking into your body and you can't see what they're seeing often. Some OBGYNs are trying to change that, but sometimes you look at the screen and you don't know what it means. So someone's looking in, a medical expert is looking inside of you to interpret very emotionally significant information, and you don't understand the information. Sometimes you've never met the person before. How odd.
Very odd.
And so I think the book is also about who is the expert of your body, what is a lived experience of a body versus all the expertise you get as a patient and as a woman around your body.
Who is the expert of your body? That I want to underline that too. I mean, I think that's very interesting because of course it should be ourselves, but on the other hand, and so maybe in a way you could say that like our own personal experience of our own bodies is something that bridges us to other people. It's like you need that community, you know, you need someone to deliver that baby, you need, you know, someone to look, do I have something in my eye? You know, does this look weird? I mean, I love that kind of community is woven because we all need expertise in addition to our own in order to live with our bodies.
I mean, one of the greatest examples to me about that, about needing other people for your body, is the example of tickling. You can't tickle yourself. Can't do it. You wouldn't laugh. It would not tickle you. But if someone else does it, it's funny. Why? Because we do need other people to pick things out of our eyes and deliver babies and tell us what's inside our bodies. But I do think the way Western medicine sometimes does it can feel alienating and not like you are in relationship with the lab technician. It's almost like they're trying to take it out of relation. Like, let's all be clinical just in case there's something upsetting inside your body. And if there is, please leave our office
leave quickly.
And go to another office, you know.
Yeah, I mean, you did just pull it out a minute ago too, is like if you're all involved with your body, then maybe you're ignoring your mind. You know, it's the Cartesian split that we're all still dealing with. Body lower, body more crass, more coarse, head, brain more elevated, more whatever, you know, but that so many complexities, so much trouble that gets us into.
Well, Aristotle, I think his idea of conception was, and the Greek idea of conception was that the man offered the idea and the spirit to the process, and the woman had the bodily stuff.
Right.
You know, she offered the body.
The container.
Yeah. Should I read this second little bit?
Definitely.
Just so
Tell
we
us
know
what
where we're
happens
headed?
next.
What happens next? Okay. So I did it. So the pregnancy was quite high risk and dramatic with the twins because I had a condition called cholestasis of the liver, which can kill the babies. I'm going to skip over that. And they were delivered, and that was miraculous. The day after I gave birth to the twins, the lactation consultant came in to see how the babies were feeding. My mother was in the corner holding one baby while I breastfed the other. The patient lactation consultant tried to teach me how to feed both of them at the same time. There was the football hold. That one was tricky. Then the lactation consultant looked at me curiously. "Your eye looks droopy," she said. Taken aback by the apparent non sequitur and comment on my appearance, I tried a joke. "Yes, my eyes are a little droopy," I acknowledged. "I'm Irish." Most of my ancestors, after 1 or 2 gin and tonics, look sleepy, so crinkled and heavy do their crescent eyes become. "That's not what I mean," she said, kind but firm. "Go look in the mirror." I got up to look in the mirror in the bathroom. The left half of my face had fallen down. Eyebrow fallen, eyelid fallen, lip fallen, frozen, immovable. A stroke? I was astonished. My face hadn't felt any different before I looked in the mirror. After looking in the mirror, I felt like an entirely different person. I tried to move my face. Impossible. Puppet face, strings cut. I came out of the bathroom. My mother saw my face and was alarmed. I called my husband, who is always calm, and told him that I couldn't move the left side of my face. He told me to call the obstetrician immediately and have him call a neurologist. Then he said, "I'll be over in 10 minutes." Tony's a child psychiatrist. He is the sort of person people call in emergencies, the sort of person who neighbors, friends, and strangers tell me brightened their day with the warmth of his regard. Though his voice was calm on the phone, I knew that he thought I may have had a stroke. I'm the granddaughter of a doctor, the sister of a doctor, the niece of 2 doctors, and the wife of a doctor, so I speculate that either it was a stroke or Bell's palsy. I'm bad at science, but I have differential diagnosis in the blood. Perhaps more important, my mother once had Bell's palsy in her 50s, so I knew and she knew what it looked like. A neurologist came in, a man I will later grow to despise, but he was a benign enough presence then. He asked me to try to lift my eyebrows. I could lift one, but not the other. He asked if I heard a ringing in my left ear. I did. He diagnosed Bell's palsy. I asked the neurologist if the Bell's palsy would go away, and he said sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. There is no way of knowing. That was not terribly comforting, but I was relieved not to have had a stroke. Then the efficient steroid prescribing, short of stature, short on advice doctor left the room. Tony arrived. All the doctors left, except for my husband. The twins were in the baby nursery. Outside, a blizzard was gathering force. The room was quiet. That night, I cried in the hospital bed with Tony holding me. I wept into his eminently cryable chest. "I'd rather not be ugly for you," I said. "I consider my husband a handsome man." "You never will be," he said, and he held me.
So beautiful, thank you. So many things to say as that part of the story gets going. It makes me think about what's visible and what's invisible, chronic conditions that so many people have that you might be able to see only a little, or you might not know. You know, so many of these strange companions that we travel with that are kind of these secret relationships. I'm thinking of a friend I have with epilepsy. I mean, everyone has a million examples, but are just like, she has this strange companion that affects her life that you wouldn't necessarily notice. But in your story, especially here, it's so specifically drawn that you can see it. And it's really, once you see it, then you start to feel it. You didn't feel it before you saw it, and then your mother sees it, and then Tony sees it, the doctor sees it, that it's this thing that actually can't very well be hidden because it's your face. And then you have wonderful material in there about the smile and kind of the history of the smile and the expectation of the smile and what kind of smile you're supposed to have, what kind of smile women are supposed to have. And, you know, you've talked before about how it brings up this kind of specter of vanity. Do you want to address the visibility and vanity question?
Sure. I mean, it's funny. I have a friend, Tina Howe, who's a playwright, who read the book and was sort of ebullient and then said, "But Sarah, I didn't know you were vain at all. I thought you just thought about plays all day and never thought about your face at all. I'm shocked." And I said, "Well, I didn't think of myself as vain particularly. I just thought I didn't want to be, quote unquote, disfigured." But she had a point, a fair point, I think, which is that if you are involved in something, a job that has to do with thinking, or if you're a feminist or an activist and you don't put a lot of stock in what you look like, and you don't like to think of yourself as vain, you might be surprised that actually it upsets you when your face doesn't look the way it once looked. And I think for me, the worst part was the lack of affect. So the worst part was meeting strangers and them not knowing how I felt, or looking at the twins and not being able to give them a full smile when they smiled at me, feeling like I couldn't mirror it. And so when that came back, things went a lot better for me. You know, I think that profoundly depressed me. And then the vanity, I mean, I do think as women, we're often taught culturally that our face should look the same as it did when we were 21. And we should buy a lot of creams and skincare products to achieve that.
To recapture. Recapture that look.
Right. And it's, you know, why? Why should we look the same?
Well, it's not possible. That's the other problem.
Well, one of my friends said, well, either you look old when you're old or you look weird when you're old. It's one or the other.
Yes, I don't know if this is relevant, but here we all are. I was thinking the other day because my mother-in-law, I've always been a little bit like, why is her eyeliner so weird? You know, it's like she starts it like in the middle of the eye and then it goes back. And I've always been like, I don't know, Chris, she's such a pretty woman. And then her eyeliner is so bizarre. And then I've lately realized you can't see your eye. That's why. You put your glasses on, you can see your eye, but then you can't get the eyeliner in there. So you're putting your eyeliner on when you can't see your eye. Like, no wonder it looks weird.
Again, you need someone to tell you. And this brings up another point, I do think, which is that it's not polite to ask people about their face. So
Yes.
when I had Bell's palsy, there was no sort of social discourse of like, what's going on with you? You know? Why does
Yeah.
your face look different than it used to? No one asked. They might have thought, but they wouldn't ask. And so maybe that's good, but also it allowed no room for conversation about it. And I think that can be quite isolating. Like if you break your leg, you have a cast, and someone's like, oh my God, you broke your leg. What happened? You're like, oh my God. Yeah, I was doing gymnastics and it broke. But if you suddenly get a neurological problem, I think a lot of people wouldn't want to ask you about it. And so therefore you don't talk about it.
That is fascinating. I mean, of course that's true. As soon as you say it, I'm like, yes, of course. Nobody wants comments on their face. I mean, and actually that's a real sign of intimacy. Mm-hmm. If someone, you know, like my daughter or my husband or whatever would be like, oh, you say something about my face. But even my mother comments on my face. I do not like that. It is uncool to me to have faces commented on. So
it's taboo, and yet you know you have a really good friend if she says you have something in your teeth. You're like, oh, thank you. We really are friends.
Right, and you're grateful for it. Wow, so that's just, it feels like it's like such a new relationship with your face entirely. I mean, not just with illness but just like, what is this plane and how it negotiates your relationships in the world?
And to be blunt, when it was acute, and it was acute for a very long time, most people recover within 3 months, and I didn't. And so to be blunt, my relationship with my face was I hated my face. So I hated something that felt like me. Do you know? So I think writing the book was, in a way, trying to change that narrative. And thank God for writing. You know? Writing is like another empathetic mirror, or can be.
Thank God for writing. Writing is like another empathetic mirror. So that's a beautiful narrative, you know, when the literal mirrors, or even the mirrors of some other people, fail you, that through writing you can create another mirror, an empathetic mirror, to your experience?
If I was a healthy individual, I would have just found a Bell's palsy support group online. But no, I had to take 10 years and write a book.
Well, let's table that question. Why don't you read us what happens next, and we'll get back to
Okay, well, I'm really
that.
sort of skipping to the end. This is a bit of sort of lessons learned or not learned. I listened for way too long to the wrong story about my face. I listened to a neurological expert who said that after 6 months my nerves would no longer grow and that it didn't matter if I did anything to help my face. He turned out to be wrong on both counts. It's not uncommon for women to listen to and believe the wrong stories about their own faces. Not only was I listening to the wrong narrative, I was writing the wrong narrative about my illness inside my own mind, a narrative full of shame and blame. It took me 10 years not only to find the right experts, but to trust myself as the expert of my own story. Yongey Mingyur Rinpoche, a Tibetan monk who once left the comfort of his robes and monastery to travel with absolutely nothing, no money, no lodging, no food, writes of how we all have to contend with birth, aging, sickness, and death, but that, quote, they can be experienced without extras, without compounding the suffering with storylines that solidify our misperceptions. As a writer, I should have been aware that the shape of a story can make things worse. It took me a decade to change my narrative about my face, or to leave the story alone, to let the muscles be merely the muscles on my face, and to use my ability to make up stories in the service of making up other different stories.
That's a fantastic passage. Wait, could you read the first section of that just one more time? I just feel like we need to hear it again.
Maybe.
Ending right before Rinpoche.
Yeah. Not only was I listening to the wrong narrative, I was writing the wrong narrative about my illness inside my own mind, a narrative full of shame and blame. It took me 10 years not only to find the right experts, but to trust myself as the expert of my own story. Which is also something I learned from the great Gloria Steinem. I had been writing a movie about her life and got to meet her, and she's an extraordinary person. And that's really one of her great themes, that when she does organizing and she's doing story circles with women, that those women are the experts. They're the experts of their own story.
That those women are the experts of their own story. And you have that line in there about women not being, I don't remember exactly what it is, but being trusted or being able to tell their own stories, being able to be right about, especially stories about their body. You know, you think of that in the medical, this interacts with some of your work too in the Vibrator play, if you guys know that, In the Next Room or the Vibrator play, and just, you know, it's a beautiful play, and it's also a comedy, and it really is about, you know, the most intimate experience of a woman's body, of their orgasm being something that men were inventing and experts on and understanding what it was for.
And naming.
And naming, right, yeah. So that's very interesting. That also brings us, I mean, so when you read the book, you'll see all the fantastic journeys that travel between these three moments that Sarah shared with us here. What will happen at the beginning of the story to the initial diagnosis of Bell's palsy, and then to kind of a circuitous story, and then where, you know, what kind of happens there at the end. And it's a great journey. It's interesting because you kind of can't put it down. It is a gripping story. And it's interesting that it is, because, you know, I was like, well, I haven't had this exact experience, but nonetheless, I was like turning the pages and fascinated by it. Okay, so you just said a moment ago, before we went on to that, if you'd been a healthy individual, you would have joined a Bell's palsy support group. And then you say in that place here that that you just read, the story, the narrative you were telling yourself and were living was connected with shame and blame. And when I did first read the book, I did have a lot of questions about shame. It really did open, like that was a very interesting, I thought, strong thread through it, of why so much shame awakes in us in moments where we did nothing, you know, and then what that shame causes us to do or not do, and then what eventually brings us into a healing story.
And what's interesting about shame is I feel like shame is often associated with specifically things we did not do. You know, that guilt, usually you have some agency, but shame, whether you're talking about, you know, sexual assault survivors or, you know, various kinds of horrible experiences that can give rise to shame. Why shame when you did nothing? And I think it has to do with losing control of the body, with the body not belonging to you. You know, like every child feels shame when they wet the bed. They didn't mean to. They lost control of their body, and that's shameful. And so I think with the face, it was as though there was something shameful about not being able to control the face. And for instance, you know, I talk in the book about how I finally, years later, while writing the book, talked to a good friend who's a neurologist, Julie, and asked her more about the condition and what I might do and what I might have done. Why didn't I call Julie 10 years ago? And I think it has to do with shame and not putting a friend in the position of delivering bad news and saying there's nothing you can do. And it's interesting, but the neurologist who became kind of a bad character in the book, when I came back to him after 6 months for a checkup, he was like, yeah, you have a tic, you're not better at all. And I felt ashamed, as though if I'd been a good patient, like the majority, I would have gotten better. And maybe I did something wrong. I didn't sleep enough. I don't know, eat the right foods. But it was in his affect. I felt irritating as a patient to him because I wasn't fixed. I felt that this might have annoyed him. Now, this is complete projection, but that's what he was communicating with his voice to me. There was no compassion. And I wanted to tell him of my progress. I can blink now. Blinking is a big deal when you have Bell's palsy. It's like, won't he be excited I can blink? No, he wasn't excited. He wanted me to do experimental neurosurgery, which, by the way, are two words I think you should never put them together. I was like, oh, it's experimental to take a little bit of my thigh and stick it on my face, like through my brain. No, thank you. Not that interested. But I don't think I knew that I was ashamed also. I don't think I knew I was feeling that until years later, reflecting back.
Wow, that's actually just so heartbreaking. I mean, I think it's familiar to us, and that's why it's heartbreaking. We're like, right. One, I didn't know I was ashamed. So I was acting or not acting out of shame. I didn't know it. So then what are you supposed to do? And the feeling of, not being able to ask your friend who's an expert. That is actually, in a way, it's bizarrely hilarious, that moment in the book when you're like, wait a minute, you had this friend who's, and for 10 years you didn't speak with her. But again, in a way, it feels so normal, so strangely normal. And you do get the image in the book of just becoming isolated. Kind of, if you think of it sort of as a myth or a fairy tale or whatever, it's like the main character becomes really sunk inside themselves and removed. So these logical questions, which now occur to you and may occur to a reader, like, what about a support group? What about your friend the neurologist? These seem so easy things to do, but
I think they also require an acceptance that things are not going the way they should be. So also the other narrative in your mind is, I'm going to get better. I'm going to get better. I don't need to do anything. I just need to take care of my babies and my older child be in a marriage, write my plays, teach my classes, and I don't have time for this. I don't have time to be sick. I don't have time to consult experts. And I don't want my friend to have a medical gaze when she looks at me. Do you know? So I think there's all of that. But the fairy tale idea is interesting. I think about Winter's Tale and Hermione, the frozen statue. And there's a chapter in the book about that and about how one day she wakes up. And Jonathan Kalb, who is a dramaturg, had invited me to Winter's Tale, and he had Bell's palsy that never got better. And when I was writing the book, I finally had lunch with Jonathan. Again, something I might have thought to do years ago, but I didn't really occur to me. And there was something so wonderful about sitting down with someone who'd had similar experiences. And he sent me a book after the lunch, a book he'd written about the theater and duration and time. And he wrote in the flyleaf, "Methinks 'tis time to smile," from Twelfth Night. And it was experiences like that in the writing of the book that felt actually like the writing brought some healing into life.
Oh, yeah. That's a beautiful section of the book, too. I really do think of the story as a healing story. But it's not a simplistic healing story. It's certainly not a formulaic one. And it begins with Bell's palsy. It is about that. But it really does invite, as we said earlier, many people's chronic conditions. And it does take us on a journey of like how elaborate healing really is. And slow or spiraling, right? Or it's like this, or it's not like sickness, healing, and we still want somehow culturally those simple narratives. But I love this narrative because it is like this one thing gets better, but then this other thing is harder, and then it's just like what you have to walk through, and then how you're encountering doctors who are like, you're not better, who really are seeking this. But what you have to be willing to like travel this circuitous road to really get to a more healed place.
Yeah, and what's interesting to me watching your gestures is, neurons are circuits and dendrites, and they kind of go like this. They don't go like woo, like in a neat arc. And when I teach playwriting, I teach my students draw the arc of your play, and it can look like a spiral, or it can look like anything as long as you know the structure. Whereas, the Aristotelian Hollywood structure would be like this kind of arc. And I remember once teaching a class, I think it was an undergraduate male student, and I was asking him to describe the shape of his play, the structure of his play, and he was like, well, it's kind of like this. It's like it's going, and then like boom, and then then it's over. And I was like, I think he just described the male orgasm. I just thought it was so funny. And what you were doing was sort of like, it's kind of like, ooh, it's, so again, I don't feel essentialist about gender. I don't think men and women have one way of seeing the world. But I do think we have inherited a certain kind of Western storytelling that really likes that. Mm-hmm. And when you have a story in your life that falls outside the range of that, it can be also disorienting.
Yes, and it seems like that's what can lead to the shame, right? Even if you don't believe in it, even if you don't want it, even if shame doesn't make any sense in this situation, you're still kind of like, but aren't I supposed to be able to deliver a narrative that's more Aristotelian, in my life and with my body? So you said when we began talking, and we're kind of, gradually and circuitously nearing the end of our moments together here, but you said in the beginning that, you weren't sure you had anything to say, and you didn't want to write about it for the reasons we discussed, and then you said, and then I discovered I had quite a lot to say. What kind of things surprised you when you actually turned your writing to this question? What has come out, or what's in the book that you're surprised by, or that was really unexpected?
I mean, in a way, all of this whole conversation, all of this was a surprise to me. And what also surprised me was that writing led me on a path of a bit more agency. So I thought, well, I'll do anything that doesn't hurt. I'm writing about it, so I might as well investigate. Now, again, a normal person might think I may as well investigate, not because I'm writing about it, because it's good to investigate the body. But again, as a writer, I felt, well, I'll try physical therapy because I might be able to get some good scenes out of physical therapy. And it turns out physical therapy helped me. I had no idea that it would. I had gone to physical therapy once early on with Bell's palsy to a friend had a high-end gym, something I never normally enter. And she said, "You've got to see my PT. He's amazing." So I went, and I still couldn't move my face really much at all. And he had a mirror, and he asked me to do expressions in the mirror. He'd asked me to grimace and all these things I really couldn't do at all. And another guy walked by the gym who was friends with him, and he said, "Dude, that's crazy," because my face was making very strange expressions, and he took a picture with his iPhone without my permission. And so I thought, I'm never going to physical therapy again. So it took me 10 years to try again. And when I tried, I found a woman who herself had Bell's palsy. And again, the experience was so different. It wasn't like a guy asking me to look in the mirror. It was a woman asking me to look at her, saying, "I will do these expressions with you. Now smile." And I would smile at her, not in a mirror. And so I started thinking about muscles in terms of function and how strong is the risorius muscle, not how does it look when I smile, but how much can I do with my face.
Well, that's so interesting because I feel like that's so resonant with other stories that I've heard of engagements with the body that are surprising and different, or injuries or disabilities or whatever, and that this, like, what does the body look like, transforming through this effort into, no, what can the body do? And so often, I mean, in so many, I think of Sonia Renee Taylor in The Body Is Not an Apology, which I also highly recommend. And a lot of that is like, I think it is true that it's especially of women, but I'm very aware it's certainly not only of women, that this thing of what the body looks like is your currency in the world. Mm-hmm. That's your value. What your body looks like is your value. And so it really is a transformation, which hopefully maybe does happen as we get older. I mean, that's what it's just like, if you're going to be healthy and you're going to be getting older and you're not going to recapture that earlier state, that there is the strength of it, like the walking, the carrying, the singing, the cooking I can do, the whatever it is, like the hugging, the teaching, running, whatever's in our lives, the petting the dog, what the body can do is kind of infinite, even if there are things the body can't do. There are infinite things it can do, but we have to really find that bridge to that from what does the body look like.
And I think you're right about the currency. And we live in a vain culture. Let's face it, we live in an Instagrammable vain culture for men and women, but it affects women differently. I think most men would agree. And the currency for women getting older changes. Mm-hmm. And there's a chapter in the book called Kill the Ingenue, where I just felt like, I just hate everything about ingenues. Reading them, writing them, living them. The unknowingness of them. So it brings our conversation full circle to menopause and, embracing the old crone.
Embracing the old crone, indeed. And we also both have teenage daughters. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting about the ingenue because, of course, the ingenue is not a real teenage girl who are very complex. Mm-hmm. I mean, they're just like, there's a lot happening and there's a lot of darkness and there's, you think about, wow, if we could, if we could have honest, engaged conversations at that teenaged point and at this menopausal point and at every point in between. And of course, listen, this is for non-binary people and men as well. And, the being rooted in our bodies with delight and capability. My gosh, that's what I wish for us. And I do think the book, it lays that path. I do think it really lays that path.
Being rooted in the body with delight and capability. I think that's wonderful.
We'll put it on a t-shirt. In our last few minutes, is there any kind of response you've gotten to the book that has been unusual or notable?
I've heard from a lot of people, and it's been very moving. And I heard from one woman who'd been an actress in LA and got Bell's palsy, and she'd been on camera, and she said it was effectively career-ending. So she moved to Rhode Island and started writing, in fact. Heard from another woman. It can be, Bell's palsy can be linked with postpartum. They don't really know why, but you can get it in your third trimester postpartum. So I've heard from a number of women who've gotten it postpartum. And I heard from one woman who said, not being able to smile at my twins was more painful than giving birth. And I just used to sit in my closet crying. So I have heard from people and hope to continue, connecting with readers. Another writer wrote and said, I carry the luggage of Bell's palsy with me wherever I go. And I thought that I think you talked about carrying a chronic illness around too, the idea of carrying it and feeling like, again, it's not in the public discourse, that it's highly visible and yet kind of invisible too, because it's not talked about, because it's taboo.
Like you're not supposed to have it, when really, like, why aren't you supposed to have it? Mm-hmm. Like, is having perfect bodies the thing that's expected of all of us?
Here's actually an interesting story to do with something that, again, it kind of blows my mind in terms of shame. So my husband is half Thai, half Australian, and his stepmother, who was born in Thailand, I didn't actually know what kind of disability she had with her face. I never asked. It just seemed impolite. And at a point, after the book came out, she wrote me and said, I didn't know we both had Bell's palsy. My God, I've known this woman. I didn't know she had the exact same thing. I mean, she called it Bell's palsy, but in fact, she said in Thailand, she'd had a tumor as a baby, and they'd done experimental neurosurgery to get the tumor out, but they cut her cranial nerve as well, and they never kind of told her how to properly rehab it. So she called it Bell's palsy, but I didn't even have a name for it because it seemed too impolite to ask. Here we were related. She is my, step-in-law mother. I don't know, but we're...
Stepmother-in-law.
Thank you. Oh my God. Stepmother-in-law. Never talked about it. That would have been a perfect person to talk about it with. But it just seemed rude to ask.
Yeah, so then we return to silence, right? To the culture of silence. And I think, this is a great thing the book does, is it invites you to speak. And it's like if you give it to someone as a gift, or you both read it, or it invites speaking. It invites speaking about like the weird creatures we don't talk about who stay with us in terms of our bodies, the similarities we have, and I think taking on that silence it seems hugely important, and it seems to me like a spiritual question, really, not a religious question, obviously, and everybody entertains that word spirituality differently, but that there really is okay, we're living in our bodies in this moment in time with each other. How can we be authentic as possible in those relationships?
Well, and we didn't talk about spirituality or religion much, but I love a good spiritual autobiography. It's one of my favorite forms. I seem to read a lot of them, starting with Augustine and then going all the way through. And I love watching people have a spiritual transformation, in the form of a confession or a memoir. I mean, I don't actually like the word memoir because it reminds me of sort of tell-all, gossipy kinds of metrics. But watching someone find peace or be on the road to some kind of illumination is something that I love reading. And I know you're a practicing Buddhist, not to out you about that.
Buddhist outing.
But the book also investigates some of that movement.
I think so too. I just think it's kind of the most precious story in a real way, not in a like precious is bad way, but in a just like a most valuable story is how we start here. I mean, that's the core of the theater,
Yeah.
one might say, is transformation, right? You start here, someone, series of circumstances, whatever transforms, there's transformation. And then you're at a different place. There's some kind of different place. And not every play is like, you're in a bad place, then you transform, then you're in a good place. Like, it's not that simple, as we were talking before about the circuitous route, but it's still that. And I think what we're doing as theater artists is trying to make that moment of transformation feel really real.
Yes, and I think there have been times as a player where I've resisted, say if a dramaturg says, "What did your character learn by the end of the play?" And I'm like, "Nothing, nothing." But really, I think I resist that in a slightly reactionary way because I resist the hegemony of the well-made play.
Mm-hmm.
However, I think there is something deeper to that question. What did the character learn? And it doesn't need to be digestible, but how did the character transform? I do think you can ask that of almost any play. I mean, even Waiting for Godot, where they sit in the same place and do
Yes,
this.
but there's a leaf on the tree.
Right.
And the boy comes.
Right. Something must change.
Yeah.
I mean, entropy doesn't allow us not to change. So detailing that, even with paralysis, when you feel like you're on the slowest, most frozen place, eventually something changes.
Yes, or is in the midst of changing. I feel that's a really good place
I
to
think that's our
end.
ending. Yeah.
All right. Sarah, it's been so delightful.
Thank you.